Some units, when they're released, are immediately and obviously strong. Some take time for people to see their full potential, while others just seem to not get any love. And the more and more units release, they fall further and further behind. So following our list of the top 10 units that aged like osmanthus wine, today we're going to go over the top 10 units that aged like cocoa goat milk. Welcome to Jello Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. Since we did recently make the other top 10 video, I did want to talk about a few units first. Some people did point out that Mona did used to have the Morgana team, which I completely forgot about. I've talked about it a lot on this channel. I don't know how I forgot about it, but she launched with that team pretty close anyways, and so she was very good at the start. So you could actually say that Mona fell off. It's probably incorrect to say that Mona aged like fine wine. I still like don't like totally disagree with what I said, but I definitely move her way down the list since she had a great team at the start. Diluc, I actually don't disagree with my placement, at least not very much. Maybe I'd move him down a little bit, considering he was considered a top DPS in the beginning. But the thing was, he wasn't actually a top DPS in the beginning. People thought he was, but he wasn't actually. He was, you were better off using DPS Bennett, unless you're doing some super jank melt or dragon strike stuff, which I generally don't consider when I'm rating Diluc. So I don't disagree. I think with my old self, I think Diluc aged like fine wine. Some people thought that Baizhu belonged in Aged Like Fine Wine, and you could argue that. He was definitely received very poorly in the beginning, and he did get a lot more usage with the release of Novelette especially, but I think he was pretty good off the bat, and he didn't really get too much better. Like, he did get a lot more usage with Novelette team, but I think now with Xilonen, his usage will go down. And I think like he was always pretty good, and he's still pretty good. I think he's had some ups and downs, like he was received really poorly, and like Aggravate is still one of his better uses. He was always good in Nilou, but not necessarily peak for either of them really. And then now he was good in Novelette, not necessarily peak, but very comfortable. And now we have Xilonen, so he's definitely not peak Novelette anymore. So I would say that he aged like cheese. He started out pretty good, and then he's still pretty good, you know? Not a top of meta character, but not a bottom tier character either. I always rank him pretty high on my tier lists. And then we have Kokomi. I have a complicated history with Kokomi, being that most people think that I always underrate her. When she was released, she had a very, very poor reception, but she was actually pretty good on release. In particular, her Ayaka freeze stuff and Electrocharge was pretty good back then, and she was generally a pretty comfy pick. She aged pretty well into the Dendro era, being sort of either a Cope Hyper Bloom character or a really good Nilou character. She's still technically peak for Nilou, although if you run her on full EM, she's very uncomfortable to use, at least for me, or healing takes a hit, but you can build like a hybrid and it's really, really good, arguably peak Nilou. She got a buff with Farina in Mono Hydro teams. Her Mono Hydro teams were quite good, but now with Xilonen, she's no longer peak Mono Hydro, so she's, I think, aged reasonably well with the meta, because Freeze was one of the stronger teams in the beginning, and she was best in slot generally for Freeze because of AoE Hydro application and comfort. Even though people didn't realize it at the time, she was still quite good in Freeze. And she, as the power level of the game has increased, her team options and her team power has increased as well. So I would kind of put her in the same lines as I did with Hu Tao and the others, in that she kind of kept her place in the meta. Not peak of meta, but always stayed pretty solid. So that's what I think about Kokomi. She definitely has you could have argued she aged like fine wine pre-Xilonen, I think, because she was, but even then, again, she started kind of good, so it's more kept up with meta. But I definitely think that she's still a solid character, and yeah. So these are the characters I wanted to talk about for Aged Like Milk. Not all of them have Aged Like Milk, by the way. I'm just going to get that right out there before you go comment below. But they're all the characters I want to talk about in this video. And then we'll work towards the list at the end. Starting with Ayaka. She definitely started off really good. She was one of the best DPSs, and she sort of got a bit better. And then cryo has just completely fallen off, like completely. I think cryo is probably the worst element right now when we consider everything that Geo has going on lately. I think cryo is the worst element. I'll probably make an element video sometime. Subscribe if you want to see that. I do think cryo will get better, and that's going to be a big part of my top 10 characters for future improvements or for future investments. Subscribe if you want to see that video. That's coming right up next. So if you're mad about where I put Ayaka and Ganyu, just please hold on before judging me and watch one more video before you unsubscribe. You will, if you hate me now, you will like me more after the next video. So, but Ganyu, Ayaka, Eula, Shenhe, these characters age terribly, but we'll talk about them one by one. Ayaka works best when you can hit a bunch of enemies with her burst. And that's why she's so good with freeze, because freeze allows you to keep them all still, and her burst has pretty good AoE, really high multipliers, and so hitting a bunch of enemies with her burst is so powerful, and still to this day is very powerful. And she does even good raw damage even against single target if you invest well, and her best single target damage has increased with Shalonin, so it's not like she's terrible now. Just because she's aged terribly doesn't really mean that she is terrible. You can still brute force the abyss with her. She's still quite good. There's some melt-ish stuff with Furina, Bennett's Xiangling that I still really like for single target, or stuff that's unfreezable, but it's just freeze has really aged poorly, and melt doesn't really work too well with Ayaka. And so overall, she's just fallen off. She used to be really good, and now she's like good enough, but she's aged. Her kit is very unsynergistic with the way that the Genshin Impact meta is right now. Very similarly, Ganyu also has aged very poorly. Her melt teams were always kind of reset impact. They were great. They're almost kind of like Mulan teams are now, but they do obviously less damage. I think that there is plenty of room for future potential with both Ayaka and Ganyu for future melt stuff. But right now, you don't really like melt is just a pain in the butt to use. It can still be used. You can still get some good clears, but Morgana freeze was just so oppressive and so broken for so long. And then melt was good for a while. I think melt might even improve with Moika. That might even happen, but they're just lacking so many tools, both for freeze and for melt. We need a freeze reaction rework, in my opinion, and then we need melt buffers, maybe even melt improvements. Yeah. I'm gonna put Eula on this list because in the beginning, yeah, she wasn't top of meta, but she was reasonably good. Like, she was reasonably solid in the beginning. The power level was just a lot lower, and you have to remember she was also released before Kazuha, so the power level of most teams was just lower at that time. And so Eula, yeah, maybe she wasn't peak, she wasn't top of meta. She was top of meta for screenshot and people were talking about her like she was so broken, and maybe she wasn't top of meta at release, but she was pretty comparable, if worse, but reasonably comparable to other DPSs of the time. Like, we didn't have Yolan yet. We didn't have so many staple. We didn't have Nahida. We didn't have Hyper. We had so many staple characters were missing. And so Eula, to me, is maybe the quintessential character that aged like COCOGOAT milk. Another reason Ganyu has to be here, of course. But she's like the quintessential character because she could have gotten so much better. She could have gotten a bunch of physical supports that actually worked with her, or they could have added different cryo and electro characters that actually synergize well, and they still could do this, but they just don't, and they just won't for whatever reason. And all of her flaws have been so exacerbated with multi-wave and pushing all sorts of different things to make her really age poorly. Shenhe, also same thing, hottest character in Genshin Impact, coldest place in the meta. It makes me so sad, by the way. For a lot of these characters, these are some of my favorite design characters, all of them. And yoimiya, and so many of these other characters that I'm going to talk about. But Shenhe, she was a solid pick for Eula teams, a great pick for Ayaka teams, a solid pick for Ganyu teams. But she's only as good as the best cryo DPSs, and as cryo fell off, so did she. But it's worse than that in that other buffers, such as Furina, came out that buff basically as good as her. Not quite for cryo, but like pretty close, and Furina does more damage. And so overall, like, she's really, even if we get better cryo stuff, I'm still worried that Furina will just be better. They'll really have to release some very specific units or give some very specific buffs to the cryo reaction to make Shenhe super relevant again. So all four of these characters have aged terribly. We talked about Morgana a bunch, and of course we can't talk about Morgana without talking about Venti. Venti, another character that aged absolutely terrible. Pretty much the definition of this whole category. Started absolutely top of meta, and then now he's basically a useless pull in terms of meta and your Abyss performance. I think you still got some Imaginarium Theater use, but you pulling a character for Imaginarium Theater, not the smartest idea, I think. He's basically one of those characters that either he's broken or he's basically useless, and they just won't let him be broken because it makes the game too oppressive. So I really think we need a Venti rework. I think they need to buff Venti in other ways. I think they need to break their rule of not buffing old characters and introduce a bunch of buffs. I really do, because that's what needs to be done for Venti, and I think that they can. Hoyoverse, if you're watching this, just buff some old characters. Just do it. I know you like to buff characters by introducing new characters, but for Venti, he's an Archon. Let's buff Venti. Let's buff the old Archons. Let's buff Venti. Let's buff Zhongli. Let's buff Raiden. And that's my opinion. Speaking of Archons, a lot of people got mad at me for saying Nahida fell off, and it's true. Nahida got worse relative to everything else. She was top of meta. Now she's less top of meta, but she did not age like COCOGOAT milk. She did not. She got worse, but it's okay. In fact, I'm probably not even going to put her on this list. I just wanted to talk about Nahida because I wanted people to know that she is worse than she was. She hasn't gotten any new teams in a really long time, and the top teams no longer use her, so she's definitely falling off, but she's still a great character. Awesome character. Still a tier 0 character. So I'm not going to put her on this list, even though she is not aging like amazingly well. She's started so high that even though she's falling, she's still so high, right? That's the thing we're talking about here. Similar story for Xingqiu. He also has the advantage of being a 4-star. If he was a 5-star, we'd be talking a bit more trouble. But yeah, Yolan is better, in my opinion. Farina is better, in my opinion. And now we have Novelette, and there's lots of other, we have Mulaney, there's lots of other Hydra characters. Mulaney basically is not even in the consideration for Xingqiu. But he still has some uses. He's still very good. He's still a good, solid replacement. He still does good damage. He still has the comfort. So he has gone down in value than when he used to be. He used to be a tier 0 character. He used to be top of meta, maybe the best character in the game at one point. He's no longer that. But he did not age like COCOGOAT milk. You know, maybe aged like, as we said, maybe aged like cheese. I want to talk about Beidou. I think Beidou is like a really interesting character. Like she's such like a good character actually, but also kind of not. And what I mean by that is she has a lot going for her. She's got this defensive, interruption resistance, damage reduction kind of bend to her, which makes her really powerful with certain combinations. Like Taser, who used to be quite good with Xingqiu, Fischl, and Sucrose, and you basically have with the stacking of damage reduction, it's very useful. She does great damage in specific scenarios, but there have just been no characters that have come out that really work with her. And I think that she's pretty tied to Fischl because she needs lots of electro particles to get her burst off. And yeah, you can build more energy recharge, but then you lose out on damage, and she doesn't work very well in single target scenarios. And somehow it seems like she just doesn't get very many character synergies. I really wish Hoyoverse just let her work with Raiden. This is another thing. Just go back, Hoyoverse, buff Kujo Sara, right? She's not good enough. Buff Kujo Sara, and then let Beidou work with Raiden, right? If you did this, you may not even have to buff Raiden. And give the people what they want. It's not that Beidou, like, she didn't really get worse. It's that she's not getting any character synergies. Every time I try and use her with new characters, it's either you have to build so much ER that she doesn't do damage, or she would work, but it's kind of a single target oriented team, or the electro character doesn't give enough particles. She does have some synergies, but she's never like one of the better characters. So I don't know. I don't know if I want to go age bad or got worse, but it's okay. I think people want to like Beidou, and they do like Beidou, but do you actually use Beidou? Tell me, do you actually use her? I don't know. Now, yoimiya had a ton of hate in the beginning, but she wasn't that much worse than Hu Tao when she was released. Like she's always been worse, but she wasn't that much worse. Now she's way, way worse, and they released Arlecchino because Hydro Resonance really buffed Hu Tao, but not yoimiya. Arlecchino and Hu Tao are not nearly as reliant on a shielder as yoimiya. Okay, guys, people are not happy with me clowning on yoimiya. Yoimiya is one of my favorite characters overall, personality, and even her gameplay, and her damage really is pretty good, her single target damage. But having literally no AoE is really bad. And when you do less single target damage than characters that do have AoE, that's not good. So it's not that she's useless. It's not that she is can't do damage or can't clear. It's when your specific strength is not even the best in its niche and it comes with a big drawback. That's really not good. That's another character they need to buff. So I'm gonna say she aged bad. I'm not gonna say she aged terribly because she does work with Furina, and Furina Shilonen, I do like the teams. They're good. She still does good damage. It's really Arlecchino that aged her the worst. That's part of what aged her bad also. I'm gonna get so flamed for this video. It's gonna be great. Is how poorly Yunjin aged. They just didn't give her enough in her kit. She just doesn't do quite enough. Her buff just isn't powerful enough, or she doesn't give enough quality of life. She needs too much ER. She doesn't do any damage. She gives like a solid buff, but it's just, she needed to be more overtuned. That's another character they could do for a buff. I really like her. What is Shilonen, Yunjin, yoimiya, Furina? Yunjin, Furina, yoimiya. It's just that when you're using Furina, you really kind of want another off-field DPS, because Furina can buff multiple off-field DPSs. So the fact that Yunjin doesn't do damage really hurts her for those types of teams. And we also have characters like Yelan who buff and do damage, Furina buff and do damage. And the fact that Yunjin, like, she can work with Wanderer and Ayato, but those aren't top tier DPSs. She's not a top choice for those characters either. And her stacks run out quickly in AoE. It's the same problem with Shenhe as well. So like Ayato is like an AoE character, but doesn't work with Yunjin because the stacks run out too quickly in AoE to get, you don't get enough hits that are buffed. It does work with yoimiya in single target. I will give one caveat to yoimiya, is that I don't yet have her weapon. I don't have her signature weapon. I've been using Aqua or Rust. The yoimiya lovers, you can hold on to that I don't have her signature weapon. That's why I think lower of her. Albedo, he has aged, I think, terribly. Mostly just because Chiori came out and Chiori's just strictly better than him. He does do some AoE, so he's got that going for him, but it's really not enough. It's kind of funny. Maybe he hasn't aged terribly, because at least he's gotten new artifact sets, new weapons that work with him. He's gotten a lot of buffs, but they haven't been enough. It's just another character they just need to buff, right? They just need to go back and buff a few of these characters to make them better. I think Cryo the character specifically don't need a buff. It's just the reactions that need a buff, or new synergies that need to happen. But for Albedo, I think it's his kit. His burst being attack scaling and buffing EM, it has some fun uses, but it's not enough. I think maybe Albedo with Shilonen on a Arlecchino vape team, maybe. But then you're missing out on Bennett. The EM buff is just not so great, because you don't usually want to use Geo on reaction teams. Usually they're just not synergized with reaction. What we need is a Geo character that actually buffs reaction damage, and then I don't know, maybe there's some world in which you could release like a cool character that has a cool synergy with Albedo, or a Geo character that builds EM and that wants other Geo characters on the team, so that Albedo's EM buff actually does something. I don't know, but he didn't age too good. Chiori, it's too early to say that she aged bad, right? It's just that unless you have C1, if you have C1, she aged amazingly with Shilonen, but without C1, her Shilonen synergy is just non-existent, and I just wish Shilonen had a construct, man. That would have been so cool. So like, not having like Chiori, she needs a construct at C0, but the last two Geo 5-stars they've released, aside from her with Navia and Shilonen, don't have constructs, and it's just not looking good for her aging well. So I'm not gonna put her on this list right now, but God, Hoyoverse, please make it make sense. Goro right now doesn't have a team. He's lost. Ito is better off running Furina, Yelan, Shilonen right now, and it's actually quite good. If you have those characters and you haven't tried it, try it. It's quite good. And so Goro is kind of lost. I think that there's still lots of potential there for something. They need a final character for that team, for Ito, Chiori, Goro, blank. There's one they need to release some character that works great in that 4th spot, or a new defense scaling DPS. I think Goro totally has potential to be a good character, so I'm gonna put him in got worse, but it's okay, because I still think he has some potential. Ayato, it's interesting. He wasn't that great to start with, but he definitely got way worse with the release of Novelette and Furina And he was better. He got kind of improved in the Dendro times because his lower multipliers didn't matter as much when reaction-based stuff was so good. Like, I still love Ayato Baiju for a Nilou team. I really like that. And Ayato still clears well with Farina, Bennett, Kazuha. Like, it's a nice feeling team. You know, you're using 3 of the best buffers in the game, so it makes sense that it would do well. But Ayato still feels like a good character in that team when you're fighting an AoE. Like, it feels really good. So I kind of feel bad putting him on this list because he started out kind of mid and he's still kind of mid. So it's kind of, I don't know. I don't think he quite belongs on the list because he was never like, it's not like he was released and he was top of meta and then Novelette came out and now he sucks. He was out and he was all right. And now he's still kind of all right, but maybe a bit worse. But it's not like he aged like COCOGOAT milk, I think. Sijouin, where is my Sijouin? Oh, there she is. Yeah, obviously she also wasn't released in the best spot. So, but she did immediately get worse with Shalone. And it's like, here's a healer. And she doesn't do that much, but she's kind of best in slot for Mono Hydro. So at least there's that, right? And then, oh, by the way, here's a character that's way better for Mono Hydro. So take a hike. And now I don't even know what you do with this character. You pull constellations is what you do with a Caesar or Sijouin. That's all you can do. All right. And I do want to say, you don't have to care about this, right? If a character falls off, it's no big deal, right? Most of Genshin isn't endgame. It's a PvE game. These characters can still 36 star the Abyss if you use them on the right team. So you don't have to, like, this isn't that serious, right? You don't have to, like, be super mad and stuff. And it's just my opinion. If you think I'm wrong, that's fine, right? So I know that you guys are going to be super civil in the comments and it's going to be super understanding and you're going to agree very respectfully, right? Like, that's going to happen, right? Because you know that I don't take this that serious. Like, this is my job, so if anything, I should be taking it more seriously than you. But you know who I think got worse, or if I think yoimiya is bad, it doesn't really matter, right? You know that, right? You guys all get it. You're all smart. Okay, who aged terribly? I think Venti #1. I don't know who. I'm gonna put Shenhe above Ayaka because you have Farina on those teams. I really like Ganyu, Farina, Bennett, Shengling. It's my guilty pleasure team. So I think Ganyu aged a bit better than the others. Something like this. There it is. There's the top 10. What do y'all think? I think I'm pretty happy with this. Let me know what your thoughts are. Let me know who you disagree with. Let me know who you think should be on the list, who isn't. And remember to take deep breaths, go outside, relax, and have fun. Take care. Bye for now.